So to pick, you mentioned something really important. It depends on where you think the aim or the goal is. Actually determines how you react and what you do, right? So you said if holiness is the goal, then of course the things that you do and you don't do matter a whole lot more. If Jesus is the goal and you know Jesus, then that matters not as much because the pursuit isn't looking a certain way. The pursuit is getting close to someone who is the way.
Yeah, and so.
Kia ora koutou, welcome to Lunch on the Way. This is Joey, joined by Graeme, and today Jonathan is not here today.
No.
Because he's too busy for us.
Well, it's a short week here in New Zealand, so, some of us taken Monday off. Well, yesterday is Waitangi Day, so for those that are listening in outside of New Zealand, Waitangi Day is a pretty important day for us in New Zealand because it goes back to the Treaty of Waitangi.
Which is the formal formation of New Zealand as a nation from a Western understanding perspective.
Yeah, and it's a big deal at the moment because that seems to what's being occupied in the news because there's a bit of talk around what does the Treaty of Waitangi actually mean?
Yeah.
And on it goes.
And then people are coming up with things that might not be completely aligned with an historical interpretation.
I tell you what I like, without being political, I've listened to a bit of commentary.
Yeah.
And I heard the interviewing Christopher Luxon.
Yeah, so that's a
Prime
Minister.
And I really liked his response. And some people going, but what I really like about it is his positivity. He said, where else in the world do you get people that don't agree with each other, but we're all wanting the same thing?
True.
And meeting together and listening to each other.
Yep.
I thought that was pretty positive.
Yeah.
He was really positive about it. I'm thinking, it kind of rubs off.
Well,
I like that.
This is if we break down a national conversation to a marriage, you've got a problem in the marriage when two people can't even talk to each other.
Yeah.
Or two people can't even agree on what. On a positive future, So if there's two parties within the signing of the treaty, and they both can't talk to each other, which clearly did not happen. They talked to each other quite aggressively at times, which is still talking.
Yeah, that's right.
And
you go, he's right. I'm going, that's a good thing. Yeah, and particularly in the moment, the world we're living in at the moment, where debate really is not happening because people are too scared to say what they think.
Yeah.
Or there's a dominant of one
for sure. I'm of the we'll pivot over to what we want to talk about a bit more, but I'm of the idea of get all the bad ideas out there. Get as many ideas out there on the table as possible because all the bad ideas are going to get exposed as bad ideas. I think if you feel like it's all about power, then you don't want different ideas because you feel like that that people can be misled through ideas, which obviously has happened in history.
Yes.
But I think in the country that we live in, get ideas out there, and the bad ideas will die off because they just won't make sense.
That's right, and that's debate. That's debate, and that's democratic country. That's the genius of it. Really is.
Yeah.
So, and I think there are important values to hold on to.
So the conversation today, because we don't have Jonathan, we wanted to talk about a particular topic that we're going to shelf for next week.
Yeah.
And that's around the idea of how we are always in a Protestant mindset, where we always are looking to reform things. And you might be thinking about that within church life, but this actually far goes beyond church life. It goes right to the heart of how we feel like we need to progress or change things to make it more authentic or more real or more what it should be. And that's the idea of Reformation that actually was beginning with Martin Luther back in the day. But maybe we'll leave that one.
Yeah. Well, it'd be good to have Jonathan on that conversation.
We need him on that one. I
think that plays out in lots of different ways. So Andrew Root's book, can't remember the name. It's one of his latest ones.
Yeah,
talks a little bit about that. I mentioned that to you, which I think we could bring up again next week. But just a bit of a sample is that he was talking about the way in which we think about this kind of reforming.
Yeah.
How that gets translated into innovation and creativity as being kind of really important things.
Yeah.
and that's sort of tied to mission. There's a story around that which makes sense of that, but let's pick it up next week.
We'll pick it up next week. But today we're going to talk about just general spirituality and spiritual conversations. Here's something I want to start with, and maybe we'll go into your quote a little bit later.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in university, one of my lecturers or professors said, there's a lot of professional Christians out there. And I knew what he meant when he said that. It was, I think we were on a missions trip to Guatemala, and we were just having some good conversations, him and a few other people. And he's like, there's a lot of professional Christians out there. And what he meant by that statement was, watch out, Joey. You can be a pastor professionally, but don't let that pastoral profession turn you into a professional Christian, where there's almost like there's no heart and there's no soul to it.
So what do you mean by, just to draw that out, what do you mean by professional Christian?
Where you go through the motions of religiosity without actually having the heart or the spirit disposition towards the practices that you're doing.
Yeah.
Where everything is pointed towards an outcome that is directly tied to your vocation. Or not even that, for people who aren't pastors, that everything that you do spiritually is actually tied to a particular outcome you want to see in life.
Yeah.
And so you see everything spiritual as a mechanism to, if I do A plus B, it's going to equal C. And then spirituality becomes a formula. And then you get into, so what he was saying was, well, watch out, because one day you could wake up and realize you don't even have a relationship with Jesus, but you're a pastor.
Yeah.
Because everything you're doing, it's like, well, I need to read my Bible and pray because I'm a pastor. Or I need to have moments of where I pray for other people and witness because I'm leading people as a pastor.
Yeah.
And that's what you should do. And you can only lead people as far as you've gone yourself. Or as opposed to the proper disposition, which is, well, I want to pray and read my Bible to cultivate that relationship I have with God.
Yeah.
And I want to, reach other people because of what God has done in my life.
Yeah.
And it gets really bad when you realize that you don't want to take risks as a pastor because you don't want to jeopardize your job security over what you might be thinking God is calling you to do.
Yeah, it is a trap. It's interesting you say about the kind of mechanical mechanism thing, and that's, I know this is maybe a bit of a jump, but I do kind of think this is sort of the left brain, right brain thing playing. The left brain is always kind of it's very linear. It sort of wants, it's function, it's logical. So what's his name? Wrote the book Master and His Command,
Master's Emissary.
What's that?
I forget his name, but
yeah.
The Master is Emissary.
But he talks a lot about the fact that the reason that we in Western culture that we've kind of forgotten about the kind of transcendent or the sort of spiritual, and a kind of not religious, but not spiritual, is because the culture is attuned much more to this left side of thinking, that everything's a kind of formula and mechanism, and I mean you do see that in Christianity too, some things I pushed against at different points in time. I felt like they're a formula. Something comes out. I don't want to pick on, but this would be an example, like the purpose-driven life. I felt like that was just like, in the end, everybody jumped on the bandwagon. It was just it was a mechanism.
Yeah, so that's a book that Rick Warren wrote.
Yeah. Great book.
Yeah,
I'm not saying it helped a lot of people, but I'm just saying it can move that direction. That it just, I can remember people. Purpose-driven life. There was another one about purpose-driven church, and you turn all the church into small groups by using this book.
Yeah,
and people saw exponential sort of growth in small groups, but it was all over in about 18 months.
Yeah,
and so, it wasn't connected to a kind of engagement with Jesus, with a deep spiritual life. It was a means to an end.
Yeah.
So I think you're right.
No, yeah, and if we're picking on Rick Warren a little bit, which he's a great, I don't have anything against him. I don't know him personally. From the outside, he seems like a great guy. I always qualify everything I say about that, but it's okay to kind of observe what people do and see what's going on. I remember a very common practice that he had that was used in my pastoral ministries class back in the day as an example of what a discipleship process could look like or should look like was bases in baseball. You know how there's first, second, third home?
Yeah.
You may have seen it, right?
Yeah.
And you're all about trying to get people through the bases into home.
Yeah.
And so what that looked like was first base was, oh, they're a Christian and baptized. Second base is, oh, they're serving.
Yeah.
Third base is they're in a small group or a home group or some type of study.
Yeah.
And then home plate is where they are like a leader leading others in those areas. And that might be a complete butcher of what it was, but I think that's pretty close. And so that was the idea of discipleship. But I'm like, that seems like it's a formula for like, once you get to home plate, you've arrived. And I'm like, and then, anyway.
Well, no, and look, and a number of churches have adopted that.
Yeah.
You know, Church Growth Movement adopted that. You know, so you at the Willow Creek, you've got Saddleback, and then there's various other sort of versions of that as we've gone through the 2000s and the teens, of the 2000s. So, and this is an interesting thing. And so, like, spiritual practices are really important. You gonna take a break?
No, keep going.
So spiritual practices are really important. But if we could easily sort of turn those into something where I do these things that I make myself feel good.
Yeah.
You know, look, I'm doing all these practices. I fast, I pray, I read my Bible, I do acts of service. I'm not bad, I'm kind of, and I think that becomes problematic too.
Yeah, and why do you feel like that? Because
Well, I think so. What did you go? Because of our humanity, we're broken and we're sinful, and we go, actually, that other person's not doing that, and I'm doing that.
Yeah.
So I'm doing all right.
Yeah, I'm not as bad as that person down there.
That's right. Yeah. So I might be a little bit better.
Yeah.
Than that one because I'm doing all these things.
Yeah.
And that's a subtlety. It's a subtlety that can trap us into feeling like we're perhaps a better Christian than the other person. So I think partly about this is, when I was thinking about this is, and I was reflecting on a book that I'm reading by Thomas Merton, and it reminded me, when I growing up in a Christian family, I often heard, the songs in Sunday school, those verses in Romans, for the wage of sin is death, and all those sins, that we're all sinful.
Yeah.
That's become more relevant to me as I've got older.
Yeah, and in what ways?
Well, I use the way that our humanity is broken.
Yeah.
And sin is all around us. And therefore I'm sinful. That's not a kind of, oh God, I'm a worm stuff. It's just a realization that in my humanity, I'm human. So, I'm always going to be, I need to stay near to Jesus. I think that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's got a short accounts. It's not kind of beating myself up. I did this wrong. I had this bad thought. It's just that I'm prone to actually sinful behavior. Mm-hmm. And I keep that in mind. So I think it's a really important thing to just have this idea that be aware of our humanity.
What's the quote? What's the quote that you had? That was really good.
Yeah. Well, this chapter is sort of talking about union and division. He says at the beginning of the chapter, in order to become myself, I must cease to be what I'm always thought I wanted to be, and in order to find myself, I must go out of myself in order to live. I have to die. The reason for this is that I am born in selfishness, and therefore my natural efforts to make myself more real and more myself make me less real, less myself, because they revolve around a lie. Now, what he's basically saying is this, I think this idea of we sort of go on ourselves to try and, and we have this idea of we comparing ourselves to make ourselves feel good. He later goes on and talks about this in terms of our Christian, our practices and our spirituality. And he goes like this, and now I'm thinking of the disease which is spiritual pride. I'm thinking of particular unreality that gets into the hearts of saints and eats their sanctity away before it's mature. There is something of this worm in the hearts of all religious men. As soon as they have done something which they know to be good in the eyes of God, they tend to make its reality to themselves and make it their own. They tend to destroy their virtues by claiming them for themselves and clothing their own private illusions of themselves with values that belong to God. Who can escape the secret desire to breathe a different atmosphere from the rest of men? Who can do good things without seeking to taste in them some sweet distinction from the common run of sinners in the world? Basically saying is that, if I do all these things, I can do all these things, kind of, they're important virtues, but we take them from God and we take them to ourselves. In other words, I sit there and I go on, it reminded me of Luke 17. The priest that goes in and goes, I'm glad I'm not like him.
I'm not a tax collector.
yeah. And Jesus responds accordingly.
Yeah.
That text actually reads you.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, I think when it comes to spirituality, the comparison game is so real. And I think what that does is also create a sense of complacency within you, because I don't think it takes a lot of effort within a local church to be externally the most spiritual person in the room.
No.
It really doesn't. Really, what it looks like is you serve, you maybe raise your hands for worship.
Yeah.
When people ask you to pray, you actually do pray.
Yeah.
I feel like the bar is pretty low in some regards.
Yeah.
And so if you're comparing yourself to others, you're not really, you're not actually living into what God might have for you.
So here's a question. I mean, both of us have met really people in our lives that have really impressed us as being truly deeply Christian.
Yeah.
What does that look like for you?
For me, or what they...
Well, yeah, you go, so what is it about you that when you see something, what is it that you see that you kind of admire and going, well, it's,
Yeah, I guess what I see in people, I can think of a few people in my life who I'm like, wow, I really admire that. And honestly, they're mostly people from my past.
Yeah. So what qualities?
I would say qualities of consistency is one.
Yeah.
Where it's like they appear to be the same person they are in public as they are in private.
Yeah.
They're consistent in their temperament.
Yeah.
They don't fly off the handle, but at the same time, they're not like, I guess, soft-spoken.
Yeah.
They can be bold when they want to, but they don't exercise that boldness in a way that is self-serving.
Yeah.
There's obviously a clear spiritual dimension to the authority that they might possess, which would be clear spiritual authority, not just positional authority. I'm thinking of one person in particular who was the dean at the university I was at for 4 years, and he seemed like he just seemed like he was a guy of integrity. And whenever I was at chapel services, and say the speaker would say something that would be a little bit, I'm like, I'm not sure about that. I just look over at him.
Yeah.
And then if he's nodding, I'm like, oh, okay. And if he's if he doesn't do anything, I'm like, I wonder. So it's like I looked to him implicitly for like a sense of kind of guidance and explicitly in some spiritual ways as well. Yeah. How about you?
Oh, well, I mean, obviously been with people that have been extraordinarily gifted, and have been seen as sort of, the kind of person to look up to. But I think the people that have really struck me as people that have, if I could distill it down, have been deeply human.
Yeah.
So some of the things that you just said, they're consistent. They have a kind of, they are here what they are here. They're not two different people in different places. In other words, that with the ordinary or lowly, they are what they are. With the and they don't necessarily they take time to be interested in you.
Yeah.
That sort of, so they're deeply human.
Yeah.
That have this way of actually having been hospitable, that they actually make you feel, wow, gee, that was so great just talking to that person.
Yeah.
And you were asked, why were they so good to talk? Because they were interested in you.
Mm-hmm.
And which may have been the eye contact, body language. And they possess a sort of deep wisdom that that they're not telling you what to do. Yeah. But they have this deep life experience.
Yeah. And would you say you were quite close to some of these people, or were you a bit distant? I was
thinking about, like one person that I deeply admired was my mother-in-law. She was profoundly wise, and just had this deep wisdom about her. And partly that was that my father-in-law was a pastor, and he was a godly man too. But they'd been through really difficult stuff, and they were just gracious. So, but it was that kind of, that they could laugh too.
Yeah.
Like they weren't so, they could laugh at the funny things of life.
Yeah.
And so it's that kind of humanness about them, but deeply grounded in a Christian understanding and love Christ.
See, the reason why I ask that is because I think a lot of the times the people we really idealize are the ones who are distant from us.
Yeah.
We don't know personally. Like, we wouldn't actually know what their private life is like.
Yeah.
The perception that we're given is that. But if you really admire somebody who you actually know quite well, that just speaks volumes. And that kind of, when, you're probably more candid with your wife than you are with your colleagues, right?
Yeah.
Clearly, I am too.
Yeah.
And I kind of shoot from the hip a bit more when I talk about circumstances, maybe other people or something.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm more calculated in public.
Yeah.
But a part of me wonders what level of personality actually lends itself to being somebody who's more holy or spiritual. Because I'm like, if we look at myself a little bit, from my family origin, my family's quite a loud and boisterous family.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that we are. I'm quite toned down just living here. If I was in Atlantic Canada, I'd be a bit more in your face.
Right.
Not in a bad way, just in a I would really be engaged in a conversation, and I'd be walking over you in conversation because that's just a part of the culture.
Yeah.
Where you're walking on each other's sentences almost.
Yeah.
Where that's very rude here, know. But a part of me is like, well, is somebody who's more spiritual or more holy or has a better relationship with Jesus, are they allowed to be boisterous? Or where do you cross the line from like just being yourself to being insensitive?
Well, I think that's an interesting one because I think learning to be who you are and loving who you are is a good thing. So so here's a little reflection. In one of Rowan Williams's books, I think it's A Time of Winter Looking East, he talks about Bishop, the South African Tutu, Bishop Tutu. And he said, in his book, he talks about Tutu actually was a man that he deeply admired, but he said he was a person that was full of himself, but not in a way that was sort of egotistical. But he was very comfortable with himself. Yeah. And he said he admired that. And I thought that's a really interesting observation. That, and I think that's a really interesting thing about accepting other people for who they are. Yes, sometimes, we have to modify ourselves socially. But I think at the same time, the pathway to true relationship is to be honest, is an honesty. Is a degree that you're transparent. Yeah. That you can sometimes we're all different personalities, and some people are a bit more hidden. But when you really know somebody, some people are easy to know quicker than others. And you say, well, how do you know them? It's because there's a degree of, I just know this person, that's who they are. Yeah. They're not putting on an air, they're not hiding, they're just who they are. Yeah. And they become relatable, and so there's a relationship that takes place. People that can't do that find it very difficult relationships. Yeah. Did you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I guess I wonder, like, at what degree, like culturally speaking, like I don't, it's to be insulting. Yeah. I guess where I'm from, Atlantic Canada, not in an insulting, explicitly insulting kind of way, but where you're jibing at somebody in like a playful kind of way. Yeah. It's like, it's just a part of the culture. Yeah. To where I'm like, is that tolerable?
Well, culture is an interesting thing because culture has a certain, enclave context in which certain behaviours are, that's a right behaviour, that's a kind of wrong behaviour, not in a strict sense, but, interesting, the Treaty of Waitangi, there was a bit of heckling when some of the other, Peters and Seymour, and there was a retraction by the person that organised it, apologising to those politicians. And the reason was that's not actually the way that we do it. There's a cultural thing there of respect. So I think there's these things in culture we have to respect. So certain cultures we have to be mindful if we come from other cultures to move around that, just as you have.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a sense in which we have to learn that, and I think I've done that. This is who I am.
Yeah.
And God is changing me. I think that's the part. That's that second part. So,
yeah.
God is changing me, but this is who I am, and for all the warts that I have. So I think there's a part of that in there.
Yeah.
That actually, it's that acknowledgement. Actually, I do have warts and parts about my personality, but God's working in there, and so there's a comfort in which to in the space to be yourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, because it's not like to be spiritual or holy or on the way to sanctification, which is a word that is used in theology circles. It's not to look a certain cultural way. And I know people say, well, it's the culture of the kingdom, or it's this or that. I'm like, yeah, but like if you're someone who's a sanctified, holy, spiritual Christian in the UK, that's going to look different to New Zealand, to Canada, to South Africa, to different indigenous populations, to whatever. But it's like, so what does it look like to be spiritual then? What are some of the key components? Like I guess spiritual might be a bit too of a fluffy word.
Well, maybe it's this being respectful. I mean, that's of another human being. So what does that look like? Listening. Being with a person, being interested in them. I think those are sort of some of the aspects of. Again, it sort of peels back to me of the whole thing of Jesus becoming human.
Mm-hmm.
That Jesus became human, and our life with Christ is that to be fully human is to walk in the steps of Christ.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? I think it's a really good question. So that's respectful. That's honest. So I think sort of holy living has something to do with actually becoming fully human as Christ.
Yeah. That's we're dwelling into the conversation Jonathan really touched on, I think 2 weeks ago, where he's like, I think there's a call to holiness that is like the part of this new martyrdom, is what he talked about. And I think that conversation is really coming back into vogue, saying that word, a lot more than it used to be.
I mean, the holiness I grew up with was a lot of what you do. You don't do this and you don't do that and you this. And evangelicals, I mean, I'm Pentecostal, but there's a kind of closeness mix there, is that my age group reacted to it, going, so other people are doing these things, but actually they're talking behind each other's back.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing all these spiritual things, but it stinks because they talk behind each other's back. The power grabbing, there's a lot of unforgiveness. So it sort of eroded that. So what holiness is not doing all these things. Holiness is about your whole being transformed by the Spirit into a truly full human being.
Yeah, so holiness is less about the things that you do. It involves that, but it's more about the disposition.
Yeah.
As to why you do the things that you do.
Yeah, yeah. So it's just a way of being. Does that make sense? A way of being?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm not foreign to holiness conversations. It's just,
well, your tradition is that.
Oh
too.
yeah, and I've had many conversations about that and around what this idea of entire sanctification is, and how does that relate to spirituality. But I find as much as you try and make it not about the things that you do primarily, but more the disposition of your heart and surrender to God, I find the temptation is always to gravitate towards the things that you do and the things that you don't do.
Well, maybe that's part of the problem, is that we go, oh, so what's holiness? Oh, it's this. And then we get back to the conversation that you started off with. It then becomes a formula.
Yeah.
And so it's not Christ who becomes the center of who my following is. It becomes an idea of what holiness looks like.
Yeah. True.
And then that becomes the sort of benchmark of judging other people. They're not as good as that, and they don't measure up. So I would go, well, maybe the problem is that we start to conceptualize that.
Yeah.
idolize that, and that becomes part of a sort of a Phariseeism, like I'm like a Pharisee. I'm not like that other person. So I don't really necessarily think about holiness, but I think if our lives are walking lives are walking in the way of Jesus is a whole lifetime. And I don't think I'll ever get there. And it changes because age changes and your body changes and circumstances changes. So there's different challenges in different ways, parts of the way through.
So to pick up, you mentioned something really important. It depends on where you think the aim or the goal is. Actually determines how you react and what you do, right? So you said if holiness is the goal, then of course the things that you do and you don't do matter a whole lot more. If Jesus is the goal and you know Jesus, then that matters not as much because the pursuit isn't looking a certain way. The pursuit is getting close to someone who is the way.
Yeah. And so what does that look like? Thinking about the stories, reading around the stories. I mean, there's certain little practices. I mean, spiritual reading is something that I do because it helps me.
Yeah.
It might be anybody else's sort of game, but I find like reading like this one, New Seeds of Contemplation. I think Jonathan mentioned.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm going to get that and read it. And so I'll read it and kind of chew on it and think about it, and that helps my spiritual life. So I don't know what you call that as a discipline. Don't know.
No, well, here's the thing. So in my tradition, because we have this doctrine called Entire Sanctification, or being perfected in love, which is the argument or the understanding that because of God's great grace in your life and because of the Spirit's work in your life, God can change you to the point and make you holy to the point of not wanting or desiring to sin or to do anything that would cause sin. And so that as like a pillar of like pursuit, I think has unintentionally tainted the pursuit of holiness, because I think people are less, at least initially, are less after, even though they want to say it's not true, less after Jesus and more after the results of Jesus, more after what Jesus does for them.
I think you're onto something there.
And if that's the case, then of course the externals matter a whole lot more than the internals, because you're trying to conform to what you think this image of holiness looks like, when in reality that could actually look, principally it looks the same across cultures and across times and societies, but practically it looks different because of culture and because of society, because of time that you live in. And I think my denomination, at least more in Atlantic Canada, but where I grew up, I feel like that's that the pursuit's been the wrong way around.
Yeah, well, I think this is that this comes from, which may come up in the conversation about reforming all the time.
Yeah.
Reformation, but this idea of the way in Western culture we conceptualize. So when I was doing my PhD, it was one of the particular books I read, What Do Pitchers Want? And he kind of looked at this, said that we went to the kind of, I'm not going to say uncivilized world because that's a really, but a world in which wasn't Anglophone or, to Africa, to Pacific. And we said to them, you've got idols, which maybe they did, but we couldn't see our own idols.
No.
And I think what we do in Western culture is that we conceptualize in our head something, and we actually create an idol. I think as human beings, we're our idol makers because we want to bow down to something.
Mm-hmm.
So in a kind of Christian sense, in the holiness thing, we then create the concept. This is what it looks like, and then we bow down to it.
Yep.
That's what you're saying.
By pursuing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
And then we make Pharisees of ourselves.
And then you become a professional Christian.
Yeah.
Because
because
at the end of the day, you're not pursuing Jesus. You're pursuing the outcome of what you hope Jesus does for you. Yeah.
So how do we walk this? How do we? Well, I guess it's really. It sounds so naff to say it, but it actually is just following Jesus, isn't it?
Well, it is, and that's complicated. But simple.
It's not a just. I shouldn't say just because it's not that easy.
No, but it's just in the sense of it's simple.
Yeah,
and it's a simple thing to do. I remember before I was ordained, you have to have like ordination meetings for the department or ministerial development or whatever board. And I remember my final meeting before they would say, "Yep, you're ready for ordination." Is they asked me the question, "Are you entirely sanctified?"
What are they asking?
Well, I don't know. And so I said, "What do you mean?" And it was a really weird conversation. I didn't really understand what they meant. They're like, "Well, describe to us what that means." And I'm like, "Well, discipleship to Jesus is a journey." And I don't claim that status. Nor do I need that status now as like a goal to attain to in order to achieve something in the Christian life. I didn't articulate it like that, but that's just me reflecting on it now. And I said, no, there's like basically almost every single day, there's probably something I say, I think, or I do that is not sanctified. You know, if you want to get down to it. So, and then the guy rephrased and said, "Well, do you think that could ever be something that could be done?" I'm like, "Well, of course I think that. Because who am I to limit the power of God in my life?"
Well, good answer.
I'm like, well, of course I think that. Because that's a prerequisite to being ordained in the Wesleyan Church, is to at least believe that doctrine. And anyway, when we left it at that, but I'm like, no, well, what's the journey like? And it is a journey. And there are ups and downs.
Because it keeps changing.
Yeah.
You know, you don't know what's in front of you. You know, a child can get sick. A parent can die. Your spouse can get cancer. There's just 101 things. You may be in it. You know, you're into a mortgage, and the interest rates go up so high, which is what's happening here in New Zealand, that basically it's just shut us down and life is a grind. That's not my story, but what I'm saying might be for my kids. But so what do you do? Where is Christ in that? How do you know, where? I mean, that's a good question. Where is God in the midst of that? And I think that's all through these kind of undulating moves of one's life. You're pressed in different ways to kind of come back. Well, what's really real? What's really important? And that process shapes you.
It does, and it's a process. It's a process.
Absolutely.
And so there's people. I've never had anyone tell me this, but there's people who've told me that people have told them that yes, God has blessed me with being entirely sanctified, and typically these are older people. And I don't doubt that that's the case. I don't know them, right? But a part of me is like, even if you thought that you were, that like you didn't have this desire to sin anymore, or to do anything against God or your neighbor, in an unloving way, I'm like, I don't even know if God would even allow you to think that.
I would probably struggle with that, because I go, I just know myself enough to go, I might be driving in a car and somebody cuts me off and I get really annoyed. And then I see people do, really generous things for other human beings, and I'm going, gee, I don't know if I would have done that.
Yeah, well,
you know what I mean?
But I'm just like, how? It's not to say, like, this might be an improper understanding of like that work of God's grace in someone's life, of them experiencing that level of holiness. But a part of me is like, how deep does the darkness in your soul go? Nobody really knows.
No.
And so, do you feel like you've been fully exposed? And so that's the question. I'm like, so you're saying that there's nothing more that God needs to expose within your soul and within who you are?
I don't think I could ever say that.
I don't think I could ever say that.
I don't think I could ever say that.
I might feel good about where I'm at right now, but that's not to say like a year from now, God's like, oh yeah, hey, what about that in your life?
I mean, there might be moments where you're going, gee, I feel, just really contented. But that doesn't last very long.
No.
I call those little snippets of the kingdom coming.
Yeah.
Moments where we go, we're confronted with beauty, and I'm not stressed, and I've connected with God, and then there's that moment of kind of, oh, this is just so good.
Yeah. But that's not. Yeah, it's a different thing.
Yeah.
But all right, maybe let's backtrack a bit as we kind of roll things down to close. It's about the journey.
Yeah.
And it's about following Jesus in the journey. And I've only lived, 31 years, and I already know that internal journey is bumpy.
Yeah.
It's rocky, and not because of things that you've done. It might be because of, just like you said, circumstances that come up in life, and things change.
It's the Job. I think it's the Job story.
Yeah.
So, I was,
Keep going.
What was I going to say? So I've had cancer. I hope I'm in remission.
True.
But it struck me the other day. I was thinking about this, that I move and have my being in Him.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing beyond. Life is how I'm struggling for language here.
Life is Christ.
Is Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's things I enjoy. There's things I enjoy doing, but in the end, my life is in Christ, and that's quite holding, actually. Even when you don't know some things, when you know when the future is not actually absolutely certain.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, it makes sense because it's almost like it's how Hebrews mentions that Christ or the high priest is an anchor for the soul.
Mm.
And it's less about, God anchors me and grounds me. That's not what he's talking about in that passage. What the author in Hebrews is talking about is how Christ has made it to the most holy place in God's very presence, has set up an anchor that's latched on to the throne of God, and you're attached to it. You might not be directly in that most holy place right now in the heavenly realms, but you're fixed to it because of what Christ has done. Because Christ is your life, and what may come, what might happen to you, what you might do, what somebody else might do to you, what circumstances might arise, that truth still remains.
Yeah, it doesn't move.
Yeah.
And therefore everything's interpreted through that lens in one sense, that the highs and lows of life are God is at work in them.
Yeah.
That's a good spiritual direction question, which I ask myself is, so where is God in the midst of this?
Yeah.
He is here.
Yeah. He is here. And I know a lot of my own spiritual journey has been more questions around identity and who am I? Actually matters a lot. Yeah. And I know that there's an analogy or an example where in, I think, sports psychology, if they want an athlete to perform at their best and they're trying to learn a new skill or trying to do something new, it's not good for them to think that they're not there yet. They actually need to almost have that identity as somebody who is that thing. Yeah. So an example would be, let's just use ice hockey as an example. Yeah. Let's just say I'm more of a grinding type player who goes in the corners, and I get the puck for people who then I pass it to, and they go and do the cool stuff and score, right? Yeah. I'm like, well, I knew that's been my role in hockey for most of my teenage years because I didn't mind getting too physical in the game. But if I wanted to become that player who could do stuff with the puck and be creative and score goals, it wasn't good for me to just hope that I could achieve that identity. Yeah. Actually, what resulted in me being that is seeing myself as that now. Yeah. And you actually live out of that identity. Yeah. So it's not any different to running. If you want to run and you don't see yourself as a runner, you're not going to run.
That's right.
You need to see yourself as a runner, and then you're going to live out of that identity. Yeah. And clearly that's the case with what Paul talks about. Yeah. And where your life, Christ is your life, like you've mentioned. Yeah. And it's not that, I need to do a certain number of spiritual things or practices to attain this identity that I hope to aspire to where I can actually be called a saint, as Paul says it, and really believe it. No, it's not. That is antithetical to what Paul's theology is. Yeah. He assumes, even to the Corinthians, who were pretty messed up morally, some of them, he says, no, you are, my brother and sister in Christ. Yeah. You are already identified within this group. Yeah. Go and live out what it means. Yeah. Go and live it out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that identity one's a really interesting one because that's, I do what I do because that's what, go to church, or I take the time to talk to my neighbour.
Yeah.
Not because I have to. It's kind of who I am.
Yeah.
It's my Christian posture.
Yeah.
It's just what it is.
And I'll tell you what, if we're talking about, it's easier to be self-critical of others than self-critical. I think a part of some Canadian aspects of church culture, but I think certainly in the more Kiwi or Kiwi-centric end of New Zealand culture is the tall poppy syndrome.
Yeah.
Where I don't think that philosophy, I think, is horrible.
It's
I genuinely don't like it.
Yeah.
But I feel like I live within it because I even feel it within myself. But I don't like that about myself.
Yeah.
And I think what it does is, if people are like, what is that? Well, it's when a poppy's taller than the bunch, then it's going to be cut off and lowered down or dropped down a peg. Yeah. And where that actually hinders the spiritual life is, well, maybe let's just give an example. Say you're in a church service and there's moments where people come to the front to receive prayer.
Yeah.
Well, the tall poppy syndrome, the toxic end of that would be like, well, who am I to go up and pray for somebody?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But I'm just like, that is so that's such a horrible way of viewing the world.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, no. You need to live out of your identity and let that define your actions, as opposed to wondering, I don't want to stand out too much, so I'm not going to go help that person.
Oh, and that's really true. And that's where kind of, the identity thing is we compare ourselves.
Yeah.
It's part of our know we're broken.
Mm-hmm.
So that tall poppy syndrome thing is a big thing here.
Yeah, it needs to. It's got a good safeguards.
It has these sort of things about, you like that self-reading.
Yeah.
I won't do that because I don't want to look like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm pushing myself too forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you don't. So like you say, back the other way, why do you do that? I don't do it because I'm doing it because that's what my Christian practice is.
Yeah. I find, I think that one needs to go. And I find the conversations, like when it's mentioned, say in church circles of, we have this thing called tall poppy, I don't think people see it as a negative. I think people see it more as a societal positive. When I just even how it's like, well, that's who we are. And so I'm quite proud of that aspect of us. Where I'm like, I'm not proud of many aspects of who I am, And I think that's one of the things I'm like, I don't want that to, I don't know if I'm pushing any wrong buttons here. I don't think people will be upset, but I'm like, I think it's a bad one.
Well, it stops, particularly if it's sort of stops people from being who they are.
Exactly.
Or being who we're supposed to be.
Yeah, if it stops you from living out what it means to be in Christ, it's a really bad thing.
Yeah. No, I think
if it stops you from being arrogant and hot-headed or full of yourself, maybe it's a good thing.
Yeah.
But I think that's rarely the case.
Well, a person that's narcissistic and sort of it'll fall on their face at some point.
Well, exactly. So
it kind of reveals itself.
Yeah. Anyway, any closing thoughts?
Not really.
No. We've been talking a while. It's kind of been a stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
We had a conversation before this, and so we feel like we've been talking a little while.
We have.
But anyway, that's lunch on the way.
Okay. Cool. What time?